This is the Laffer Curve. This is a chart that attempts to answer the question, is there an optimal tax rate? And if so, what is it? The Laffer Curve was drawn on a napkin by a man named Arthur Laffer in the year 1974. It was an attempt to make a visual representation of an already popular economic idea that if you tax too much of every dollar, you may end up with less total tax revenue. Here's how that works. On the y-axis, we have tax revenue, while the x-axis displays the tax rate. The tax revenue is the total number of dollars that the government collects in taxes, while the tax rate is the percentage that the government takes from every dollar. It should be obvious, but if tax rates are zero, then the tax revenues will also be zero. Very clearly, if the government says, hey, taxes are going to be 0% and we're not going to collect any taxes from any dollar, then the total number of taxes that they'll collect is actually zero. Makes sense. Similarly, if the tax rate is 100% and the government decides to tax 100% of every dollar, then the tax revenue in that situation would also be back down to zero. Because after taking every single dollar out of circulation, you leave no more money left over in anybody's pockets to spend or to invest. You take all wealth out of the economy, you confiscate it all, there's nothing left over, so then tax revenues obviously must then go to zero as well. Now, it's worth pointing out here that in a situation like this, where you have a top-down command control and we just say, okay, government's going to take ownership of everything, fully confiscate all wealth, 100% tax rate, then you would have black markets appear and you would have non-compliance where people don't pay taxes. And so there would be some wealth left over outside of the government system. But in that case, the tax revenue would still go to zero anyway, because they're not going to be able to collect on those non-compliant dollars. So it's very clear that if the government taxes a 0% tax rate or a 100% tax rate, then the revenue that they'll receive in taxes will be zero either way. But it's also very clear that the government will receive some amount of tax dollars with a tax rate that is in between that. That's demonstrated empirically through basically every country on earth that charges any taxes whatsoever, and they receive tax revenue from it. So somewhere in between a 0% tax rate and a 100% tax rate is the optimal tax rate at which the government will receive the most dollars possible. The Laffer curve is very commonly referred to by economists and politicians on the right who are saying, hey, we need to lower taxes to get back down to the optimal tax rate so that we can actually get more dollars in taxes. This is implying that the government is currently taxing at a rate somewhere on this side of the curve. And if the tax rate were lowered, then the amount of dollars the government would collect in total would actually increase. The idea behind this is that there would be more dollars left over in the economy for spending, saving, investing, more wealth would be created as a result. And then even though they're taking less from every dollar, there are a lot more dollars out there available to take from. Therefore, the total number of dollars the government gets goes up. But this curve is a double-edged sword because people on the left, economists and politicians alike, can also use this curve and say we need to increase tax rates in order to optimize total tax revenue. Their view would be saying that we are somewhere over here on the curve. And if we increase the number of cents we are taking from every dollar, then we will be able to maximize the total number of dollars that the government collects. Now, just in case you're thinking that this video is going to lead to a conclusion on what the optimal tax rate is, that's not where we're going with this, because that's actually impossible to know for a wide variety of reasons. And those reasons come down to the problem with the Laffer curve itself. The first problem is that the Laffer curve refers to the optimal amount for tax revenue, not for wealth in the economy. And that's a big difference. For instance, let's say over here, the government was charging a 10% tax rate. And over here, the government was charging an 80% tax rate. Hypothetically, those two amounts would result in the exact same amount amount of revenue for the government. In one case, the economy has a ton of money and the government's taking a small portion of it. And in the other case, the economy has a very small amount of money and the government's taking almost all of it. Either way, in both of those situations, the government is getting the exact same amount of revenue. In one case, though, individuals are thriving and have wealth and prosperity. In the other case, individuals are stuck in poverty. And so right off the bat, the entire point of using this curve is to maximize revenues for the government and really has no regard for individuals and how much of my money am I going to be able to keep? Because somehow it's considered greedy for me to want to keep what belongs to me, but it's not considered greedy for them to want to take from me what does not belong to them. Thomas Sowell. The second problem with this curve is that averages can be extremely deceiving here. Everybody always talks about the average tax rate here, meaning 0% to 100%. So the tax rate is on average 10% or 30% or 60% or 90%. So let me give you an example of why averages can be deceiving. Let's say that the average temperature in the room that you're sitting in right now is 75 degrees. You may think, well, that's a fantastic temperature for a room, so I would be fine in there. But what you don't realize is that at head level, the temperature in the room might be 400 degrees, and at foot level, the temperature in the room might be negative 300 degrees. That would not be a very comfortable room to be in, even though the average is a good temperature of 75 degrees. Your head would be cooked and you'd have frostbite on your legs. Similarly, there is no one tax rate for everybody, unfortunately. Different people, different companies pay different amounts in taxes because, number one, we have a graduated, a progressive income tax system, meaning that for more dollars that you make, you pay more in taxes on those dollars. And we also have an entire internal revenue code designed by Congress and published in order to give people tax benefits that are incentivizing them to take certain actions that Congress thinks will be beneficial to our country. And so the tax rates on every person and on every corporation in the country are wildly different. And so it's really impractical and unhelpful to talk about the average tax rate. If the tax rate for every single person and company was, let's say, 15%, that would make this country a tax haven around the world, and wealth would start pouring into this country like crazy, like it does to the other countries that are like that. But that is wildly different than having an average tax rate of 15%, where you have a massive amount of the population paying 0%, and then a portion of the population paying all the taxes, 50, 60%. Even though the averages of those two systems still might come out to 15%, you're gonna have wildly different outcomes, economically speaking, and tax revenue. And the final reason why the Laffer curve is lacking here is because taxes are only one side of the fiscal policy coin. Fiscal policy refers to the amount of money the government receives and the amount of money the government spends. If you only focus on the income for the government, you ignore, in my opinion, the even larger impact of how they spend that money and how much they're spending from borrowing. For all of American history, the amount of money that the United States government has taken in taxes has generally trended up, and in the last few decades, it has started to skyrocket rapidly. Despite this, the federal government has continued to spend at an even faster pace, resulting in more and more borrowing every single year to fund the difference. It's very clear here that the main problem is not an income problem, and that even if we can optimize tax revenues by finding some perfect tax rate, it won't mean anything if they don't solve the spending problem. No matter how much more money they've been able to receive in taxes over the decades, they've continually proven that they will always spend more. And that's where we're finding most of the problems. By the way, if you don't want to be stuck in a death spiral of debt like the United States government is, I've finally launched my brand new Debt Destroyer course that details the exact system that I used to get out of debt, $30,000 in 9 months when I first got married. I share all of the tips and tricks and all the inside stories that helped me get out of debt so fast. And it is available now as part of the membership to Heresy Financial University. That whole entire training library is available to all members. Check it out, linked in the description below. So it is very clear that the United States government has a spending problem, but what most people think is that it's not a matter of how much they're spending, it's about how they're spending it. And many people would like to see more of a redistribution effect from the government, because at the end of the day, that's what fiscal policy is. It's a transfer mechanism of wealth. Every dollar they take from borrowing and taxes gets transferred into the bank account of someone else, whether it's a politician, a healthcare company, or a government contractor, or better yet, the military-industrial complex. So the government is a wealth transfer system, and many people would like to see that wealth transfer system stay in place, but maybe go the opposite direction instead. Redistribute money from the hands of the super wealthy into the hands of the not so fortunate. Now, sometimes incremental steps are very difficult to see the results, and so it's helpful to do thought experiments of what would happen if you took something to its extreme. In the case of redistribution, this would be 100% pure redistribution, meaning that some committee decides what the income is going to be for every single person. And let's say it's $50,000 per year. If you and your job make more than $50,000 per year, 100% of those dollars will be taxed away from you. And no matter what work you do or how much work you do, you will make $50,000. But obviously there's going to be plenty of other people doing other jobs who were making less than $50,000. And so their incomes will be subsidized to bring them up to the exact same level at $50,000. And that will use the funds that it took from everybody else. Perfect universal redistribution. Everybody makes the exact same amount of money. For the young, the unintelligent, and the particularly compassionate people, this sounds like a utopia. Sounds like a great idea until you consider the immediate consequences. Work and income would dry up and go to zero immediately. Because no matter how little I work or how easy my job is, I can make $50,000. Therefore, the more difficult work that produces the most wealth will not be done because there is no reward for it. So the incentive in the system would drive everybody to not work because that's where you get the most reward for your labor. And therefore, there would be no money left over in the system, no wealth in order to redistribute. So it would result in perfect equality. It would just be equality at the bottom rather than wherever they were trying to target. And this was understood by Karl Marx when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, and that's why compelled labor is part of transitioning to communism, because understanding incentives, if people aren't forced by the state to do a job, then they won't do it if they're not needing to for their income. And so compelled labor, basically slavery by the government, is part of communism and perfect redistribution of wealth. Now, in terms of ethics and morality, obviously that utopian dream is really dystopian, and it's going the complete opposite direction. Violates literally every individual right to sovereignty. While the tax system we have today is not anywhere near there, it is slowly inching that direction. For instance, if you don't have the ability to opt out of paying for a service, and by opting out of using that service, that means you're being forced to pay for something that you don't want to use, then by any definition, that's theft. Doesn't matter whether it's 100 million people stealing for you or one person stealing from you. If somebody forces you to give you what belongs to you and you don't have a choice, that is theft. Now, at this point, most people say, well, if you hate it so much, why don't you just leave? And in most countries on earth, that is true. That is what opting out means. You're choosing to abandon use of the services and go live in another country, one that you are choosing to pay for those services. But in the United States of America, even that's not an option. If you take off and you go live in another country, the United States of America is one of the only countries on earth that still taxes you on your income, even though you are not participating in using those services. And so you cannot opt out. You cannot just leave. You do not have a choice, even if you don't want to use any of the services, which means that for most people, you are a slave to the government for 5 or 6 or 7 months out of every single year. All the dollars you make for that half a year go to pay the government that you would choose otherwise not to pay. But for fear of going to prison, you decide to play their game. Now, understanding that it's not likely that the ability to opt out will happen anytime soon, we can take a step back from there and say, okay, removing that, what's the next most fair way for taxes to be implemented? And that would be a flat tax. Regardless of how much wealth you have built throughout your life, you are not using more or less government services than other people. In fact, most often what happens is that the wealthier you are, the less you use public services. You're not using the roads more than anybody else. You're not using the military more than anybody else. And it's been shown that the lower taxes go, the more people are just happy to write the check and pay the bill and stop looking for loopholes. Now, it's true that there really is no such thing as loopholes, at least in the US. That is a derogatory term used to describe the laws that Congress has made to incentivize people to pay less in taxes by participating in certain behaviors that they think is good for the country. So they're not loopholes, they're just the rules of the game. Congress wants you to do things. They think it's good for the country, so they're gonna give you tax benefits to do those things. These are incentives that anybody has access to if you know about them and then you do them. But of course, most people are just regular W-2 employees, which is zero benefits, zero incentives. So most people are not gonna ever take advantage of these. Now, obviously, we can't control what the government does with tax rates, tax revenues, borrowing, income, spending. We can't control any of that. But what we can do is learn the rules of the game and decide to play to win. And finally, that's why I'm starting a new tax company. I'm sure every single one of you in the past has been burned by a tax preparer who didn't know the tax rules, didn't know what you were doing, did something wrong, didn't ask you the right questions. Turns out a couple years later, you realize you were leaving a ton of money on the table. And so I'm starting a company to do tax and accounting the right way for active investors and small business owners so that you don't have to keep on leaving money on the table and wondering whether they know everything that you're doing and asking you the right questions, whether they know all the tax benefits and incentives that are available to you so that you can take advantage of literally every single thing Congress wants you to do and all the tax benefits they have made available to you. So if you're interested in being notified about when we launch, I've got a link in the description below. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.